I threw away my last bottle of fertilizer on a Tuesday morning. Not because I was trying to make a statement. Not because I suddenly became some kind of eco-warrior. I threw it away because I was tired of watching my garden die slowly while my bank account bled out buying products that promised everything and delivered almost nothing. That bottle cost me $47. The one before it cost $39. The organic one before that, $62. And every single time I poured that liquid into my soil, I told myself the same lie. This time will be different. This time my plants will finally explode with life. This time I'll get the harvest I've been dreaming about. But here's what actually happened. My tomatoes stayed small and hard. My lettuce bolted before I could even taste it. My peppers turned yellow and dropped off the vine like they were giving up on me. And every time I walked into my garden, I felt like a failure wearing gardening gloves. Then one afternoon, I was standing in the checkout line at the garden center with another bottle of miracle solution in my hands when the woman behind me said something that changed everything. She was probably 70 years old, soil under her fingernails, sun-damaged skin that told the story of decades spent outside. And she looked at my bottle, looked at me, and said, "You're feeding the wrong thing." I didn't understand what she meant. So I asked. She smiled like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to ask that exact question. "You're feeding the plant," she said. "But plants don't eat what you're pouring on them. The soil eats it and your soil is starving to death." I put the bottle back on the shelf. We talked in the parking lot for 20 minutes. And by the time she drove away, I realized I'd been gardening completely backwards for 5 years. See, I thought fertilizer was food for plants. That's what every bottle tells you. That's what every gardening website promises. Feed your plants, boost your growth, maximize your yield. But that's not how any of this actually works. Plants don't have mouths. They can't eat nitrogen from a bottle. They can't digest phosphorus pellets. What they actually do is drink nutrients that have been broken down into microscopic particles by billions of living organisms in the soil. And when you pour chemical fertilizer directly onto your garden, you're not feeding your plants. You're poisoning the very organisms that your plants depend on to survive. It's like trying to help someone by killing their entire family and handing them a bag of cash. Sure, there's something valuable there. But you've destroyed the support system that makes life actually work. That woman in the parking lot grew 140 pounds of tomatoes last year from 6 plants. I was growing 12 plants and barely getting 30 pounds. And the difference wasn't her seeds, it wasn't her water. It wasn't some secret technique she learned from her grandmother. The difference was that her soil was alive. And mine was dead. Here's what I didn't know. What most gardeners don't know. What the fertilizer companies definitely don't want you to know. Healthy soil isn't dirt. It's not just ground up rocks and decomposed leaves sitting there waiting for you to add chemicals. Healthy soil is a living, breathing ecosystem more complex than a rainforest. In 1 teaspoon of healthy garden soil, there are more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. An entire invisible civilization working every second of every day to break down organic matter into forms that plant roots can absorb. When you pour synthetic fertilizer onto that ecosystem, you're dropping a chemical bomb into a thriving city. The salt content alone kills beneficial bacteria. The concentrated nutrients burn fungal networks. The pH shock destroys the delicate balance that took years to develop. And what's left is soil that looks fine but functions like a corpse. Your plants might grow for a few weeks on that chemical rush, but they're not actually healthy. They're addicted. Their roots stay shallow because they don't need to search for nutrients. Their immune systems stay weak because they're not interacting with beneficial microbes. And when pests or disease show up, those plants fold immediately because they've been living on life support instead of building real strength. This is why your garden needs more fertilizer every year. Not because your soil is depleted, because your soil is dying. And you're killing it with every bottle you pour. I stopped buying fertilizer on that Tuesday morning, but I didn't stop feeding my garden. I started feeding my soil. And the difference between those two things is the difference between failure and abundance. Here's what I did instead, and this is the part where everything changes. I started composting everything, not just kitchen scraps, everything: cardboard, newspaper, leaves, grass clippings, coffee grounds, eggshells. The stuff I used to throw away became the foundation of the most valuable substance in my garden. Every week, I added another layer: brown material, green material, brown material, green material. And within 3 months, I had black gold sitting in a pile in the corner of my yard. Compost isn't fertilizer. It's something far more powerful. It's concentrated life. You're adding billions of organisms that will create nutrients continuously for months. You're rebuilding the ecosystem that makes plants actually thrive instead of just survive. I spread 2 inches of compost across every bed before spring planting. Not as a top dressing, mixed into the top 6 inches of soil. 2 applications per year. That's it. No bottles, no measuring, no mixing. Just finished compost worked into the soil until it disappeared. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Chemical fertilizer smells like nothing. Or worse, it smells like ammonia or sulfur or whatever industrial byproduct they use to manufacture it. You smell that smell, you know you're adding something real instead of something synthetic. The second thing I noticed was the texture. My soil had always been hard, compacted, crumbly. I could push my fingers into it without resistance. Earthworms appeared out of nowhere, literally hundreds of them. I'd never seen earthworms in my garden before. And suddenly they were everywhere, doing the work I used to do with a shovel. My plants stopped looking fragile. They stopped looking like they were barely hanging on. The stems thickened, the leaves darkened to a deep, healthy green, and the roots. When I pulled a finished plant at the end of the season, the root system was 3 times larger than anything I'd grown before. And compost is how you rebuild that function without spending a fortune on bottles that make your problems worse. She told me about cover crops, and at first, I had no idea what she was talking about. Cover crops sounded like something commercial farmers used, not something a backyard gardener with 100 square feet of beds would care about. Never. Walk through any forest or prairie, and you'll see plants covering every inch of ground. They decompose right where they fell, feeding the soil and building fertility without any human intervention. But in a typical garden, we harvest our crops, yank out the dead plants, and leave the soil naked for months. Exposed to rain, exposed to wind, exposed to temperature swings that kill soil life and erode the structure we've been trying to build. Cover crops fix this. They're plants you grow specifically to feed the soil instead of feeding yourself. And they do 3 things that chemical fertilizer could never do. First, they protect the soil. A cover crop creates a living blanket that shields microorganisms from temperature extremes and prevents erosion. Rain can't wash away your topsoil when plant roots are holding it in place. Wind can't blow it away when leaves are covering the surface. And that protection alone is worth more than any fertilizer you could buy. Second, they feed the soil while they're growing. Cover crop roots exude sugars and carbohydrates that feed beneficial bacteria and fungi. Those organisms multiply like crazy around living roots. And when you cut down the cover crop and let it decompose, you're not just adding organic matter, you're re-adding organic matter that has already colonized by the exact microbes your food crops need to thrive. Third, some cover crops fix nitrogen directly from the air. Legumes like clover and vetch have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that can take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and convert it into a form plants can use. That means you're literally pulling fertilizer out of thin air and storing it in your soil for free. No bottles, no bags, no trucks delivering products from a factory 2,000 miles away. Just plants doing what plants have been doing for millions of years. I planted my first cover crop in September. After I harvested my summer vegetables, instead of leaving the beds empty until spring, I scattered clover seeds across the soil and watered them in. Within 2 weeks, the entire bed was covered in green. By November, it was a thick carpet of growth that stayed green even through light frosts. And in early March, I cut it down with a mower, let it dry for a few days, and turned it into the soil with a garden fork. For weeks later, I planted my spring crops, lettuce, peas, carrots, radishes, and the growth was unlike anything I'd seen before. The lettuce was ready to harvest in 28 days instead of 45. The peas climbed their trellis so fast I had to add extra support. The carrots grew straight and thick instead of forked and stunted. And the radishes were so crisp and sweet, I couldn't believe they came from my garden. I didn't add a single drop of fertilizer, not one bottle, not one bag. Nothing but compost in fall and a cover crop through winter. And my spring harvest was double what I'd gotten the previous year when I was spending hundreds of dollars on products that promised me the world. That's when it clicked, the entire fertilizer industry exists. Because we've been trained to think of soil as a delivery mechanism for chemicals instead of a living system that creates its own fertility when we stop destroying it. We've been taught to treat symptoms instead of building health. And the cost of that approach isn't just money, it's time, it's frustration. It is watching your garden underperform year after year while you keep buying solutions that don't solve anything. But here's what happens when you stop buying fertilizer and start feeding your soil. Here's what nobody tells you because there's no profit in sharing this information. Your costs drop to almost nothing. A bag of cover crop seeds costs $12 and covers 1,000 square feet. One bag, one time. And it creates more available nitrogen than $100 worth of synthetic fertilizer. Compost is free if you're making it yourself or cheap if you're buying it locally. Either way, you're spending a fraction of what you used to spend. And getting results that are exponentially better, your workload decreases. Healthy soil requires less watering because it holds moisture like a sponge. It requires less weeding because dense plant growth shades out competition. It requires less pest management because strong plants resist insects naturally. Everything becomes easier when the foundation is right. Your harvest explodes, not just in quantity, in quality. Vegetables grown in living soil taste different. They're sweeter, more flavorful, more nutritious. Because they're not just swollen with water and nitrogen. They're full of minerals and compounds that only develop when plants interact with complex soil ecosystems. You'll taste the difference in your first bite. And you'll never want to go back to the bland, watery produce you used to grow. But the most powerful change isn't something you can measure or photograph. It's the way you feel when you walk into your garden. There's no anxiety, no wondering if you mixed the fertilizer correctly or applied it at the right time. No worrying that you're damaging your soil or contaminating your food with chemicals you can't pronounce. There's just quiet confidence that your soil is alive, your plants are healthy, and your harvest is coming.